Alright, now I wanted to shift to the Pacific and talk a little bit about the war with Japan, some of the mistakes I see there. Um, like I said in the very first video, I don't know as much about Japan, especially their internal politics, as I do Germany. I do know a fair amount about the course of the war there, but uh, not as much as, say, in Germany. However, there's a couple things we can say about the war against Japan. One is in the American conception, we fail to realize that their main commitment, especially for their army, was not against us. It was in China, especially, but also in Manchukuo, which I guess you could almost say was China, and also in Burma and Thailand. That's for most of the army. Now, in terms of the Navy, yes, that was a big deal with us. There are two main. There were three. There were some American forces in Asia, but there are two main thrusts. There was the Central Pacific and the Southwest Pacific. And if I were to ask you to name battles you heard about in the Pacific in World War II, I pretty much guarantee that all of them you would name happened in the Central Pacific and not the Southwest Pacific. The Southwest Pacific was commanded by Douglas MacArthur, who I actually think probably had many personal flaws, both in terms of his politics and his personality. But I think he was probably the best general the Americans had in World War II. Probably the best general the Americans have had since the Civil War. And that's part of the reason you never heard of the Southwest Pacific, is because he was really smart about not fighting battles unless he really thought he had to. And that meant that not very many people were needlessly killed. The Central Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Peleliu. Actually, no, that one's MacArthur's, sorry. A couple others, Bougainville, stuff that happened on New Caledonia and New Britannia. Those are the big battles, especially Saipan, Guadalcanal. Now, these battles were in the Central Pacific, and it's interesting. The war, early on in the war, the Japanese had a really professional Air Force and Navy. They had a pretty decent plane in the Zero, and the first battles were real give or take. They gave as good as they got, and vice versa. By 1943, there had been such attrition in the Japanese forces, and at that point the industrial might of the United States was coming to bear. We were in a situation where you clearly have a much bigger, stronger opponent beating the shit out of a much weaker opponent, to the point where it's not. I mean, there's a famous battle. It's called the Marianas Turkey Shoot. It wasn't called that because it was real good give and take. We came to a position where the average American was going to be flying a plane that was a new plane, that was a new design that didn't even exist at the start of the war. A pilot who would have had something on the order of 2,000 flying hours before he ever saw combat, and he'd be flying against somebody who maybe had 25 hours, and the American would almost certainly have numbers on his side, and it was a slaughter. Part of the reason kamikazes came about is because even if you weren't a kamikaze, going up in a plane against the Americans in late 1943, 1944, 1945 was tantamount to suicide anyway, and so it just didn't make sense to even, people just realized that this is pointless, we can't win. And progressively as the war continued, the Japanese ability to even react to what was happening to them degraded. I mean, they were constrained by things that we find amazing. The Japanese fleet had to stay by Singapore because most of their oil came from what was then the Dutch East Indies, which is today Malaysia, or I'm sorry, Indonesia. Singapore is in Malaysia, but on the southern tip of it anyway. But their air crews had to be trained in Japan, so their carrier fleets and Air Force was in Japan, but their battleships and destroyers were down in Singapore, and they were in a situation where they couldn't just be strolling around looking for battle. They had to say, okay, if we want to have a fight, we got to save up the coal and oil and do one goal. And they did. There was a big battle. It's usually considered the biggest naval battle in history, called the Battle of Leyte Gulf, also known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It happened during MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines. And actually, the Japanese outsmarted the Americans and almost succeeded, and then they ended up not succeeding and being annihilated. What ended up happening is, and this is something a lot of people don't realize, is after Germany surrendered, I think it's May 7th, 1945, a lot of people realized Japan was the weaker of the two, and there was enormous political pressure to wind down the war effort. The military said, hey, this is great, we've got twice the army we need, and they were thinking along the lines of transferring hundreds of divisions from Europe to the Pacific. Actually, there was a logistical problem here because it was impossible physically to actually ship everything that was being produced in the United States from Western ports. They were going to have to ship this stuff from the east and go through the Panama Canal, and even that would have been backed up so far they would have been going around South America. The public, though, said, hey, why do we have 12 million people in the army when we only have one enemy, and it's a weaker enemy? An enemy that by this point was not even close to a threat. And they actually got a major drawdown in the number of soldiers. And then the whole unconditional surrender thing. Again, Japanese, not stupid, they knew that they were losing the war. After the Battle of Leyte Gulf, they knew that basically they were helpless. They could only hope that they could inflict a lot of casualties in defensive actions. They couldn't hope to reconquer or strike at the Americans. They were just totally outclassed. And they began making gestures, mostly through the Soviets, who at that time they weren't at war with, saying, okay, what do we need to talk about here? And they kept getting told unconditional, unconditional. And they said, well, could we just maybe have the condition that the emperor stay in power? And no, that was flatly rejected. And then you have this whole thing with the atom bombs. Now, people say that, well, if we didn't drop the atom bombs, we'd all be killed. Well, actually, Eisenhower said that it was pointless. MacArthur said it was pointless. I think actually even Curtis LeMay said it was pointless. The reason that it happened, I think, was to intimidate the Soviets. FDR had this cozy relationship with Stalin. FDR died in April of 1945, and Harry Truman became president. This is an extremely significant event, not because Harry Truman is a paragon of freedom and human rights and virtue, but because he was a consistent crony that did not have the flavor of radicalism that FDR had. And he also did not have the cozy relationship with the Soviet Union. In my experience, being anti-communist is good. It's not a sufficient qualification to call somebody, I don't know, worthwhile, but, it's better than being pro-communist. Anyway, people in his cabinet, some of them were virulently anti-communist, and the idea was, let's just show the Soviets what we can do, and this is the best way. And so they dropped these bombs, and then, the Japanese said, we will surrender, and they always still said, we would like to keep the emperor. And there's a famous conference, Truman came out and said, I have deemed this reply to be acceptable. Of course, Hirohito was left in power, and George Bush actually went to his funeral in 1989. So the unconditional thing, they actually didn't do it in the end. I guess that's good. I guess we could argue the subtlety here, but they didn't get rid of them. Anyway, I think I didn't go too much into the nuclear bombs. There's a lot of, I think Southern Avenger has a good video on use of the nuclear weapons. And I guess I could throw this in with the strategic bombing generally. That is a war crime. In the case of Europe, the British actually started it before the Americans were in the war. The British originally had imagined that they would bomb German factories. It took them very little time to realize they did not have the accuracy to actually hit factories. And they just said, well, even when we miss the factories, we'll kill some of the workers. And they said, you know what, that's fine too. And they just went ahead and just made that the policy. And they told people that they were trying to hit factories when really they knew that they were just leveling cities and butchering people. And that's really bad. I don't know. I have a hard time condoning that at all. And when we make a big deal of the Germans blitzing the UK, but literally the Allied counter was 100 times or more of what the Germans did to the UK. And of course, Japan never bombed the United States. It's at Pearl Harbor. Some Japanese children made paper mache balloons that dropped some bombs on the United States, one of which killed 8 people. Does this compare to what happened to the Japanese? No, it doesn't. And there again, Hirohito didn't even get published. Okay, there's debate about how culpable he is. Was he just a figurehead too? I don't know. Like I said, I don't know that much about the Japanese internal political things, but there was a pushback. The end of the war, the last few months, actually the way the populace was reacting to that was more akin to how they reacted to Vietnam. It wasn't all patriotism and wave the flag waving. There was a lot of, why are we still fighting? These people can't fight back. We're beating the shit out of them. They're not a threat to us. There was, of course, a lot of vengeful people. There's still a lot of vengeful people. I met some of them, and they still piss on Japanese people, and I'm like, please grow up. Whatever crimes were visited on us were visited on them at least 24-fold. I guess to say they're not crimes because it's revenge, but well, I think that's all that needs to be said there. I think I'll make one more talking about FDR's death because that's really significant. So, all right.